Guardians, Risen, Lightbearers, Warlords, Iron Lords, Shadows, and Grey Guardians, the Vanguard, and Dark Vanguard. People with power have been given many names throughout our Destiny's history, often interchangeable, but with subtle nuance and difference. For clarity, and for future reference, today we will define and understand these different groups. Welcome back, Guardians, to another Embrace Destiny broadcast. I hope this finds you well. Whether you're tuning in from Europa, catching this in a back alley in the last city, or anywhere in between, know that you're not alone. Our community grows every day, but so too do our enemies, and I constantly find myself having to switch schedules and frequencies to catch them off guard. So thank you for your vigilance and support. In continuing our Dark Guardian series, our analysis of the forces that have turned our protectors into oppressors, heroes to villains, I thought it wise to discuss the different groups seen throughout our Destiny. These definitions will help us better understand each faction's origin, context, and will be the basis of how I use the terms in this series and beyond. As always, short notes are included below for quick reference. Let us start from the beginning, with those first gifted with the Traveler's power. When the Traveler faced the collapse, it created ghosts, and these ghosts sought out their ultimate companion. This gave rise to, well, the Risen. Brought back from the dead and given power by their ghost, by the Traveler, Risen was the first name given to what we would eventually call Lightbearers. Details from this time are few, with some stories shared in the Black Armory papers and Constellation's lore book, but Risen was a fitting name. It still is, but most Risen have chosen some form of alliance or purpose, which has given them new names. Sadly, the first time that name was replaced, it brought on a dark time for humanity, the time of the Warlords. The collapse nearly destroyed humanity, and the Earth with it. Lands were changed, cities ruined, and people huddled and scattered for survival. As has happened many times throughout our history, those with power rose to protect or harass those without. During this time, many Risen took on the name Warlord, forming little kingdoms of sorts, territories under their control, forcing those under their protection to pay tribute to them. For some, the Warlords were a blessing, someone to keep enemies at bay, to protect them, and offer a sense of order. For others, the Warlords were prison wardens at best, and war-stirring soldiers at worst. The A Man With No Name lore book details some of the fallout that occurred as Warlords fought for power. These were the Drifter's earliest days, and explains a little why he remains distrustful of the light. The lore book Ecdysis details the many lives of the Emissary, she who speaks to us in the Prophecy Dungeon, and during her early days as a Risen, the Emissary hunted down warlords who had destroyed towns and villages, and even had used nuclear weapons to get their way. Today, stories of warlords are ancient history, but do arise occasionally, such as the naming of the Titan exotic Citan's Ramparts, Citan being a former warlord of Old Russia. While most warlords lived up to their name, not all did. Some fought for their people, but it was a dark time, and even heroes had to do what they had to do. At this point, no one knew where the power of the light had come from, and few felt inspired to do anything truly good, truly larger than themselves, with that power. One notable exception to the warmongering warlords was our Crucible handler, Lord Shaxx. As can be seen in the Remembrance lore, Lord Shaxx controlled a part of territory during the Dark Ages and vowed to protect his people. At some point during the Dark Ages, a few warlords decided that enough was enough. After witnessing countless tragedy, infighting, and both risen and mortal death alike caused by warlords, a group came together to protect humanity. Modeling themselves off of the legend of the knights of old, these Risen chose a new name, the Iron Lords. They vowed to act as humanity's protectors, to ride against Risen who use light against their own, against the people. You may have heard of some of these Iron Lords: Radagast, their leader, Scory, Fellwinter, Lady Aphrodite, and Lord Saladin Forge, who now watches over the Iron Banner. The Iron Lords grew in numbers and in power. Together, they cleared the menace of the Warlords, even drew Shax to their side, though reluctantly, as his first priority was his people. Eventually, the Iron Lords would lead most of humanity to the Traveler, to what would eventually become the Last City. With much of Earth damaged by the collapse or Warlord infighting, poor environmental conditions, and with humanity too spread out, the Iron Lords did their best to bring all of humanity together to rest under the protection of the Traveler. Some helped build the walls, but most Iron Lords focused on protecting the border. This is where Guardians come in. Guardian is the main and generic term used now. For most people, in most instances, Guardian means any person gifted with paracausal power. However, Guardian is a specific role, a specific name, birthed out of the creation of the Last City. As the time of the Iron Lords was fading, those with power decided, in greater number, to focus on protecting humanity, specifically within and getting to the Last City. These protectors chose and were given the new name of Guardian. Functionally speaking, in terms of how they could channel the light, Risen, Warlord, and Iron Lords were basically the same. They had dramatically different goals, but they were gifted with power by the Traveler, and they all fought similarly. However, Guardians began working a little differently. Guardians began to follow specific orders, specific leaders, and chose to focus their light in specific ways. Here is where the classes were born. Titans, Hunters, Warlocks, all are Guardians, all are Risen, but they all focus their light differently. As far as we all understand, using the light takes skill and practice. Switching from one element to another requires one type of skill and training. Switching from one class to another generally requires a deeper understanding of power and more time and effort than most are willing or able to put in. For Guardians, their goals, experience, and approach is better suited to following a specific class, rather than jumping around. This is not entirely new to Guardians, and there are exceptions throughout our history, but it is generally where Lightbearers find themselves today. Speaking of which, Lightbearer is another name you may have seen or used. Quite simply, it is anyone who has been gifted the power of the light. It applies to all of the examples I've discussed before, as well as those who have chosen differently. The Drifter is our main example. Risen during the Dark Ages, Drifter saw the terrible consequences of power, saw Warlords and Iron Lords leaving destruction in their wake. The Drifter doesn't exactly trust the Traveler. He did not ask to be brought back, nor does he know what the Traveler's limits are or its intentions. As such, Drifter has chosen to not pick a side, nor a class, and is currently described most accurately as a rogue Lightbearer. There have been others who have been distrustful of the light, or tempted by darkness. You may have heard the tale of Dredgen Yor, the shadows of Yor, or seen the Dredgens running around the tower today. Dredgen Yor is mostly a story for another time. A very important Lightbearer, Yor turned away from his responsibility as a guardian, through a corruption both literal and emotional. Dredgen Yor was originally Rezel Azir, a guardian, a titan in fact, legendary among the people of the early city. However, he began pursuing the darkness, trying to better understand it, use it, and became, well, a nightmare, hunting and killing guardians as he pleased, following his own path, and is still whispered among the city today. Those who followed him called themselves the Shadows of Yor. Some were aiming to go down the darkest path they could, to learn more about and wield the darkness for power. Others were attempting to use the darkness against the darkness, to continue protecting humanity, but through a different path. The lore books, Letters from a Renegade, the Books of Unmaking, Nothing Ends, and For Every Rose a Thorn go into detail concerning these shadows, these gray guardians. Those who walked the line went over it, and, well, it will be something we cover in a later part of our series. Some of these shadows, for good or ill, called themselves Dredgen. In modern times, Drifter began giving that title to those who are skilled in Gambit, as both a mark of their dedication and a jab/joke at the darker shadows. The book, A Drifter's Gambit, tells more. Up until now, with only a few exceptions, most of the terms we've used discuss Lightbearers, those who wield the Traveler's power. However, new events on Europa have opened our eyes to new power. Stasis, a form of darkness it seems, is a power growing in popularity among Guardians. Now, besides something like the sword logic, the Hive's philosophy which seems to follow a principle of the darkness, stasis is more similar to the light, but its opposite? To be honest, we're still trying to understand its power, its purpose. Throughout our destiny, the darkness never gave, it took. But stasis appears to be the opposite side of the light's coin. Those who wield the power feel its pull, its coldness, its potential for darkness, but can wield it just as effectively against our enemies as they can the light. This has opened a new potential for Guardians, for Lightbearers, and raises a lot of questions. We'll start with the potential dark Vanguard that is sometimes whispered among Guardians. Trust in our Vanguard has waxed and waned throughout the City Age. It is always wise to question authority and to keep that authority in check. Some Guardians, truly, barely hold the title, focusing on loot and glory, and if they so happen to protect humanity along the way, great. But, given everything that has happened to humanity, to our people, almost losing the city during the Red War, and now given new power and possibility, many Guardians are considering a slightly darker path. Eris, Drifter, and the Exo-Stranger have recently, and often, been deemed the Dark Vanguard. We will go into their stories eventually, but the short form is that Eris lost her light long ago while fighting the Hive on the moon, and the Exo-Stranger never had light, only used stasis. Combined with the mistrust of the Traveler, these three seem the closest connected to understanding the darkness, while still fighting for our survival in one way or another. How this will develop, your guess is as good as mine, but I imagine that these three will become more important as our journey continues, as we work to better understand the darkness, both its power and the entity behind it. Similarly, many Lightbearers out there may choose to use their power differently, from something as small as not simply following the Vanguard, protecting humanity in their own way, or living out their life on their own terms, like a rogue Lightbearer like the Drifter, to something more extreme, like using the power of darkness for good or otherwise. New, vague terms are arising, such as rogue or Grey Guardian. It's interesting, and perhaps it is because it is both new and taboo, but we don't really have a name for those who wield stasis. Perhaps it is because those who do, aside from the Exo-Stranger and some of our enemies, were once Lightbearers, that we just keep the old name. But would Darkbearer be more appropriate? Is there a more fitting generic term like Paracausal Wielder? Even Risen wouldn't be appropriate per se, as Aramis did not need to die to access stasis. So what would we call her? In the end, titles are important. They help us understand a person's goals, their history, their motivations. Over time, those who wield light or dark have taken on or have been given different titles that speak to their purpose. As our series on Dark Guardians continues, and as we continue to study both the history of our Destiny's lore and new events, these titles will take on increased meaning, which should hopefully help us to be better prepared for what's to come. I hope this broadcast has proven useful. While it's easy to use terms interchangeably, I hope this video has helped understand the meaning behind each. As our series continues, I want to explore the influences which have turned Lightbearers dark, or at least against humanity, against themselves, and these titles will be used throughout. And that's going to wrap up our broadcast for today. Guardians, make sure you set your ghost's frequency to this channel so you can subscribe to more content, and you can find other ways to contact me below. If you have any comments, questions, feedback, or suggestions, feel free to send them to me. I'm always inputting your data and trying to improve this series as we continue. As always, everyone, Guardians, I look forward to the next broadcast. Please be safe, be kind, and I'll see you all next time. Bye now.